So.
Could I get everyone's attention, please? We're going to get the class started. I'd like to say good evening to everyone. And the St. John Valley Senior College would like to welcome everyone for tonight's class on the Holocaust. One of our most popular and dynamic instructors, Erica Nadelhaft, is back with us for this presentation. We are excited about your return.
Thank you.
And look forward to sharing this evening with you, for sure. Erica earned a BA magna cum laude from Brandeis University, an MA summa cum laude from the Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and is ABD from the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis. She reads and works in 4 languages: Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, and German. Erica is the education coordinator at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. She oversees the HHRC educators, coordinates school visits, develops new educational programs, works with school districts and local communities to address prejudice and hate, and collaborates with state organizations such as the Maine Department of Education and the Maine Community Policing Institute. And if that is not enough, she teaches senior college classes.
It's my favorite part of my job.
And not only here, but in a lot of other senior colleges as well throughout the state. So it is my pleasure to turn this gathering over to Erica.
Thank you. I feel like I should bow or something. His introductions get better and better, you know, the more I come back. So. So thank you everyone for having me back. I really do enjoy an excuse to come back up to Fort Kent, although as I said when I arrived, the drive gets longer every time I do it. You'd think it would get, it would pass more quickly, but am I there yet? No, I'm in Portage. It's like, just when you think, you're coming into Fort Kent, I'm only in Portage. But thank you really for coming out. I know this is not a particularly happy topic or a happy conversation. I think it's a very important one right now, given all that is going on in the world. And this past, May 5th was Holocaust Remembrance Day. So it's, I think, a very important topic. And I know many of you were here in my last class when I really dove into, the history of anti-Semitism, which in many ways set the stage for the Holocaust, which I would argue was the logical next step in, what was happening in that 2,000-year history of anti-Semitism. And I know Dawn said I tend to be dynamic and bounce. I also do have 2 broken toes. So if I may bounce and then keel over, so I apologize. I managed to drop my phone on my foot and did it in such a way that, I broke my own bones. So, and also I am not this kind of speaker who can do this completely off the top of my head, so I will periodically be glancing at my notes. And I would encourage you, please, if you have a question, if something I say isn't clear, stop me. Don't feel, I should wait till the end. Just, raise a hand and flag me down. I also, my children will tell you I tend to start talking faster and faster as I get more and more involved in what I'm saying. If I am flying along at too fast a clip, again, please somebody, just, in the back, Dawn, if you would, just tone me down a little bit. Because even though it's an incredibly difficult subject, I love what I do. And I really, I love this stuff, so I tend to get very excited or excitable, I guess, while I'm doing it. And there are a couple of places in my talk where I sort of throw some questions out to the group. So I would encourage you, to jump in with your thoughts too. You don't have to, but there are things that are really interesting to stop and kind of dive into and talk about a little bit. So I would certainly encourage you to join in whenever possible. And I want to start tonight, before I kind of dive us into the Holocaust, with first talking a little bit about how Hitler and the Nazi Party were actually able to come to power so easily in Germany, and how once they did, Hitler was able to dismantle German democracy effectively and legally, and thus really set the stage for his plans, which were both for European conquest and the extermination of the Jews. And I'm starting here because it's really terribly important to understand how a civilized, cultured, scientifically and intellectually advanced, newly democratic country like Germany ended up where it did. How can and how did a genocidal, racist regime take over a democratic nation and win over a people without a military coup? So in order to understand not just Hitler's ideology, but the German people's receptiveness to that ideology and their willingness to sacrifice their democratic freedoms, we kind of need to start with the end of World War I. And some of you social studies teachers, history teachers, this may be a little familiar, but it's really kind of the starting point for Hitler. As I'm sure you all know, Germany and its allies lost the war. And the victorious parties, particularly France and England, were in no mood to be generous when the war was over. And so the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed after World War I, was really less about peace and reconciliation and more about punishment, how to punish Germany for starting the war. So Germany lost territory. They were no longer permitted to have a significant army, and the country had to pay huge sums of reparations to the victors, and very abruptly became a democracy. And then less than a decade after the end of World War I, the Western world plunged into depression. And in Germany especially, prices and unemployment skyrocketed. And so in Germany, in these years, dozens of new political parties from across the spectrum, from far-right conservative to communist, socialist parties, they were all fighting for power in this new, and to many people, very suspect democratic government. And again, let's not forget what happens in 1917, which is the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so all of this led to tremendous political and social and economic uncertainty for the German people and this fledgling German democracy. So it's really important to remember, first of all, that German democracy was not a natural German development. It was imposed from outside by Germany's former enemies, and the German people had absolutely no experience with democracy. Many Germans were completely uninvested in democracy's success, and they were actually longing for what they saw as the stability and tradition of non-democratic rule. And so life in Germany was uncertain and frightening. So how might these things contribute or create the conditions that are necessary for the rise of Hitler and ultimately the Third Reich? So in situations like this, people often look for authoritarian or decisive figures who have answers. People who are suffering, They don't want to have to dive into a history lesson or an economics lesson that explains why they are suffering. They want concrete, easy to understand reasons as to why they are suffering, whether those reasons are actually true or not. They just want a reason. And they want fast and obvious solutions. So in other words, they want someone to fix things, and they want someone to blame for the situation that they're in. So this is the stage onto which Hitler appears. Hitler was a perfectly ordinary person when he starts off. He's born in Austria. He's not a native German. He's a native Austrian. He's born into a completely ordinary family. Originally, he wants to be an artist. He travels to Vienna, but he's unsuccessful in his attempts to be accepted into art school and to become really, a self-supporting artist in Vienna. So he drifts, just turns into a drifter. He's really soaking up the political atmosphere in Austria at the time. In particular, in Austria, there was a really virulent anti-Semitism and anti-communism that was held by many of Austria's right-wing and pan-German parties. And Hitler, he wrote a lot, particularly, in Mein Kampf. And so he wrote about that early experience. And he said, and I hate to say it, I'm quoting him here. He said, "My inner revulsion towards the state steadily grew. I was repelled by the conglomeration of races which the capital showed me, repelled by this whole mixture of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, and Croats, and everywhere the eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. To me, the giant city seemed the embodiment of racial desecration. And the longer I lived in this city, the more my hatred grew for the foreign mixture of peoples which had begun to corrode this old site of German culture." So even in these early years, major elements of Hitler's political ideology and his really personal philosophy had begun to take shape. He already had a deep and abiding hatred of Jews, blaming them for his rejection as an artist and other failures of his as well, and also holding them responsible for the political decline of the multinational Austrian Empire. And he saw them already as a mortal threat to the purity of the Aryan race. And Hitler viewed Germany as a dynamic, militarily powerful, racially homogeneous nation that he believed was going to lead the Aryan race to victory in the struggle against Jews and other inferior races. So after World War I ended, and Hitler did serve in World War I, just completely nondescript, soldier. But when the war ended, he drifted to Munich in Germany. And like so many Germans, he could not believe that Germany had actually lost the war. He believed that it must have been stabbed in the back and betrayed, and that was why the country had lost. But by whom did he believe Germany was betrayed? By the Jews. And so he determined at this point, after World War I, that he was going to go into politics to create the reality that he believed in. I will spare you the many long, boring, and somewhat convoluted details of Hitler's joining what was at the time a small fringe German Workers' Party and turning it into what became the Nazi Party. I'm just going to focus on, he did it, and I'm going to focus on sort of how he did it. Hitler did make one attempt to violently overthrow the local government in 1923. This ended in failure, and Hitler ended up in prison. But he used this time to his advantage, taking the time to write Mein Kampf and becoming something of a hero to many Germans who were unhappy with the unstable and difficult situation that they were finding themselves in. And Hitler learned something from every mistake he made, at least until close to the end of World War II. And the first thing he learned here was that he needed to come to power from within the system, not without, that he could not take power by force, so he was going to have to use democracy in order to dismantle democracy and take control. So in order to do that, he needed to turn the fledgling Nazi Party into a national player. He needed a significant enough base of supporters so that he could win in both local, state, and national elections. And he did that primarily in two ways. One, through propaganda and constant campaigning. And Hitler was a brilliant speaker. He knew how to reach an audience. He knew how to rile people up, how to sway their opinions, and how to win them over. And he was absolutely tireless, traveling the country and, drumming up support. He told people exactly what they wanted to hear, that he would revive the German economy, that he would bring back German pride, that he would dismantle the hated Treaty of Versailles, and that the German people were not to blame for the hardships that they were undergoing. And he often said, he wrote and he said to his sort of political cronies and whatnot, the masses do not want complex ideas. They want simple solutions. And so he gave them simple solutions and people to blame, the Jews and the communists. All you have to do, is go online and watch one of his speeches, and you will see his charisma, the almost mesmerizing effect that he has on his listeners. And the Nazi Party as a whole, they created a spectacle, not just Hitler speaking, but there were flags and torches and marches and songs, and people wanted to belong to that. It felt like something greater than themselves. The second thing that he did was he created his stormtroopers. They were known as the SA, or the brown shirts. And so he recruited disaffected army veterans and young men simply looking for a fight. And these troops battled political opponents in the street in a show of strength and determination. And while many Germans were appalled at this sort of growing political violence, many others were in favor. So in some ways, Hitler was creating what was almost like a personality cult, where people, both ordinary supporters and party members, were increasingly loyal to him over party ideals. So when Joseph Goebbels joined the party in 1926, he summed up the feeling that so many had by writing, and now I find myself quoting Goebbels. He wrote, "We drive to Hitler. He jumps to his feet, there he is, shakes my hand like an old friend, and those big blue eyes, like stars. I am in heaven. Great joy, what a fellow. I want Hitler to be my friend." And so that's how people started to see him and started to need him and to want him. And Hitler echoed this sentiment when he wrote, "A good Nazi is one who would let himself be killed for his Führer," which is the leader, "at any time." So this idea of what they called the Führerprinzip, right, the leader principle, was firmly established very early on. That yes, the party was important, but Hitler was the party. And so your loyalty was to the person before the party. And so the party became a very single-minded one under the control of one and only one leader. Without Hitler, there was no Nazi party. And so little by little, Hitler's tactics began to pay off. The Nazi party started to win in elections. And German democracy, unlike American democracy, is proportional, meaning that numerous parties ran in elections and won seats depending on what proportion of the vote they received. So in every election, the Nazi Party did better and better and increased their proportion of the votes. One of the things the Nazis noticed, though, was that their support was primarily rural. They often lost heavily in the more liberal urban areas. They paid attention and they capitalized on this, turning their attention to farmers, to the lower middle class, and surprisingly, university students. And all of these groups really wanted to see a return to the pre-democracy days when their positions were respected and when Germany was strong. So I'm going to harp a little bit on the propaganda piece, because it was absolutely crucial to the Nazis as they built their political base. And during the years before 1933, when Hitler actually becomes chancellor, they really fine-tuned their use of propaganda. And Hitler himself established the principles on which it was based. And so he claimed that propaganda must be addressed to the masses, not to the intellectuals. Its function was not to educate the masses, but to call their attention to certain ideas. And it must be aimed at the emotions. And given, as Hitler said, the limited intelligence of the masses, propaganda had to focus on the constant repetition of a few basic ideas, eventually establishing the ideas as truths in the mind of the ordinary German. And the man who was responsible for putting Hitler's propaganda principles into practice was Joseph Goebbels. And so under Goebbels' leadership, the Reich Propaganda Office controlled all of the party's propaganda activities. And at each level, I mean, from the littlest village on up, propaganda offices were set up. And the office at the top sent down directives to the lower levels via a monthly magazine so that all the same ideas were coming out. There were specific themes and slogans that were going to be used every month at mass rallies. But at the same time, they did recognize that they needed to adapt what they were saying depending on the audience. So, they would, if they were, addressing a group of farmers, they would tailor the message so that while the overall message was the same, they were meeting the needs of the local populations. And another technique that the Nazis learned to use in their electoral campaigns was that of what they call saturation advertising. And interestingly, we do see a lot of these similar ideas, playing out in the world today. The Nazis would schedule anywhere from 70 to 200 rallies in 1 or 2 weeks in one district alone. And they used this strategy particularly in areas where there was hope of a major electoral success or a breakthrough. And Hitler himself attended many of these rallies. So the Nazis actually were really pioneers in modern electioneering techniques, and they covered Germany like in whirlwind campaigns. They went by car, by plane, and train. They held voter recruitment drives. The mass meetings of election campaigns were carefully planned, often by Hitler, down to the smallest detail. Again, marching bands, flags, spotlights, shouts of Heil Hitler, precisely orchestrated to create the maximum emotional effect. And so in these campaigns, the Nazis were able to successfully manage two conflicting approaches. Again, first, they geared their themes to the needs and fears of different social groups and promoted highly tailored individual programs depending on, where they were speaking. So in working class areas, they campaigned against capitalism. In the middle class, when they were talking to middle class people, they exploited fears of communist revolution. If they were talking to German Protestants, they spoke of the defense of religious values. So they were telling people what they wanted to hear. And at the same time, they denounced conflicts of interest, and they said, well, we stand above classes and parties. We represent Germany. We don't represent a particular class or a particular party. And they promised that they were going to build a new national community, a new Germany that would be based on social equality. And to build such a community, they said, they were going to have to replace democracy with the principle of leadership, with one man who could lead Germany to this new ideal. And so they appealed to traditional values like German militarism, national pride, national honor. And Hitler really believed that humans were motivated by more than just economic interest, what was in their best economic interest. He believed the people would actually vote against what was in their economic interest, and that such concepts as, idealism and honor and sacrifice would really strike a chord with his listeners. And so, while, again, local Nazis, local groups tailored their message, Hitler claimed to stand above it all, to stand above all differences. And his only promise was that he himself would create a new Germany, a great, proud nation where all would be employed for the nation's good. And so many, many Germans, you can see why this would be so appealing to Germans. He's not talking really about anti-Semitism. He's not talking about, well, we're going to get rid of the Jews, we're going to get rid of the gypsies and others. He's creating what sound like, on the face of it, really positive values and things that will appeal to people who are suffering in Germany. And it all really paid off. So in 1933, despite the fact that he didn't win a majority in the elections, and in fact, the Nazi Party in 1933 won a smaller number of seats in parliament than previously. But the German system being what it was, there was a lot of political wrangling and a lot of ins and outs, and governments came and went, and I will not bore you with that piece. But finally, in January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He was appointed by the president. And he had come to power legally and within the system. He was handed it. At the same time that he came to power, again, the Nazi Party was actually declining in strength. And many people believe it had already peaked when Hitler was chosen to be chancellor. It was really Hitler's last-minute acceptance by other right-wing elites that made it possible for him to achieve the chancellorship. They had concluded that Hitler was the only man who had the mass support necessary to establish an authoritarian regime that would save Germany and their own privileged political positions. They also believed, these other right-wing parties, that Hitler could be managed and that he could be manipulated. They underestimated his ability and his sheer ruthlessness. Hitler was willing to make a few compromises to become chancellor. He took carefully calculated risks, but seeing his opponents, he believed that he really had all the power he needed to go on and achieve complete Nazi domination. And the speed with which this happened really proved him right. So the chancellorship for Hitler was really only the first step in the Nazi transformation of power, because he had no intention of ruling Germany as a prisoner of the other conservatives. Within 2 months, Hitler had established the foundations for the Nazi dictatorship. And the speed of the process was one factor in how he overwhelmed his opponents. But the strong desire of the German people, too, for stability played a crucial role in allowing the Nazis to establish their rule. So on January 31st, Hitler makes a speech. He makes an appeal to the German people. And he described the past 14 years of the Democratic Republic as a German catastrophe. And he stressed how he and the other nationalist leaders had united to save the nation by creating this national government. And the task of this government, he said, was to create a national revolution where all Germans were going to unite to build a new Reich that would eliminate, as he said, the insanity of classes and class warfare. He denounced the communists as enemies of this new Germany, and of course, he denounced the Jews. So using phrases, if you listen to the words that Hitler uses and the way, he phrases things, national revolution, he keeps talking about the nation and belonging and the good that it's going to do. That's one way that he attacked his opponents and deceived his allies. Because his right-wing collaborators, they could kind of accept the idea of a national revolution as fulfillment of their own conservative wishes. And since it was a call for unity, right, you're calling for a national revolution, it was thus above party differences. And if you opposed it, who's going to oppose national revolution and national honor, right? If you opposed it, you could be labeled treasonous and someone who wants to cause harm to the German people. So labeling the communists, and particularly the Jews, as enemies of this national revolution enabled Hitler to start exploiting fears of the communists, fears of the Jews, and to really begin the process of separating, right, of othering the Jewish population. So on February 27th, the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, the building mysteriously goes up in flames. A young Dutch communist was arrested at the scene. Did he set fire to it? We have no idea. Nobody actually really knows who caused the fire in the Reichstag. But the Nazis immediately capitalized on this and claimed that this is the start of a communist and Jewish revolt. Some historians believe that the Nazis themselves, set fire to the Reichstag in order to provoke things. Others think, no, it was really the communists trying to revolt. It's never been resolved. But regardless of the cause, it prompted Hitler to go to President Hindenburg to issue what was called a decree for the protection of people and state. And this decree provided the foundation for the creation of a police state. It suspended basic civil liberties, such as freedom of the press and the right to assemble. It provided that the Reich central government could take over power in any German state that was unwilling or unable to restore public safety and order. And so the Nazis used this decree to round up communists and any other political parties that they saw as a threat. Anyone in Germany could now be imprisoned without trial. So the Nazi seizure of power now starts to become a little more violent as they work to get what they want. They needed to take control of local and state governments, kind of like the United States. Germany is made up of different states, and there's a state government and there's also local town governments. They came up with a really good way to do this. The SA, the stormtroopers, would go into a particular area. They would create disorder. They would start rioting. They would start, fighting in the streets. They would, smash shop windows. They would attack political opponents. They would do this often in disguise, just wearing ordinary clothes, not wearing their uniforms. Local Nazis would then request intervention from the central Nazi government using that decree that Hitler had passed. The Nazis would then appoint a local Nazi as police commissioner to retake order. And they would force the state governments to resign and install Nazis in their place. As one Nazi leader who was installed as state president said, "This government will brutally beat down anyone who opposes it. We do not say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. No, he who knocks out one of our eyes will get his head cut off, and he who knocks out one of our teeth will get his jaw smashed in." So again, the violence is now increasing in Germany as the stormtroopers single out communists and socialists for arrest and attack. Other party members were beaten, arrested, and sent to concentration camps, the first of which was established in March of 1933, 2 months after Hitler took power. The first concentration camp was opened. Since most of the violence was against left-wing parties, the majority of Germans accepted it and rationalized it as being necessary to maintain law and order. Okay, I'm almost done with this piece, and then we'll take a breath. So the Nazis bolstered this image of national revolution by putting on a day of national celebration on March 21st, really to inaugurate the opening of the new Reichstag, parliament session. The ceremony emphasized German traditions, German loyalty, and paid particular attention, gave particular honor to the German army. And again, this appeal to traditional values of nationalism and militarism, in the army, further seduced conservatives into believing that Hitler had become one of them. And it helps them to overlook the violence and the increasing Nazi seizure of power. 2 days later, Hitler sought passage of something called the Enabling Act. His goal was to eliminate the role of Parliament and the parliamentary system altogether. Now, this Enabling Act, which is officially called the Law for the Removal of the Distress of People and Reich, and again, pay attention to the words. Doesn't that sound like a positive thing? Removal of distress from the people. Who wouldn't vote for that? But it would give the government the right to issue laws without consent of Parliament. And such laws could even deviate from the German Constitution. And Hitler said, "I only need this for 4 years. That's all it will take me to solve Germany's economic and social problems. It's all I need to create political stability, to establish the new Germany, and then we will go right back, to where we were." Since the Enabling Act meant a change in the Constitution, it needed a 2/3 majority to pass in Parliament. The Nazis and the Nationalists together had some 340 seats, but they needed 50 more votes to pass this. And Hitler got these by intimidating the Center Party bloc, because they were afraid, well, if we oppose this, we're going to end up like the Communist Party. We're going to be beaten, we're going to be, our offices are going to be smashed, we're going to be dismantled. So they voted for it, and the bill passed. 444 to 94. Only the socialists dared to oppose it. So with the passage of this bill, democracy in Germany dismantled itself. Legally, completely, German democracy ended. So I think this leads to a couple of questions. And the first is, or maybe it's just a thought, and I'd certainly welcome your thoughts or your ideas, is how easy it actually can be for a democracy to be undermined. You can actually vote yourself out of existence. And at least for me, I mean, for many of us who grew up in a democratic system, we assume that it's sort of unassailable and that there are these built-in protections. But they, you know, there are ways around them, and I think this is a really good example of what can happen if you have someone who says, I'm going to use the system, and I'm going to manipulate the system, and I'm going to do it absolutely legally, other than, yes, setting his stormtroopers loose, you know, to cause these riots and whatnot. Everything Hitler and the Nazis did was legal. And that's kind of where they ended up. And I like to end this piece with a quote actually by Margaret Atwood that I think is worth kind of thinking about. And again, if you have any thoughts. And she wrote, "The fabric of democracy is always fragile everywhere because it depends on the will of citizens to protect it. And when they become scared, when it becomes dangerous for them to defend it, democracy can go very quickly." And I think that's what happened in Germany. So this is really to set the stage for the Holocaust, for what's going to happen. But I like to start with this. I know it was a very sort of, I was hurling a history lesson at you for 45 minutes. But often, you know, when I'm teaching, you know, students or whoever I'm talking to say, yes, but how did he get to power? Like, was there a coup? Was it the military? Like, how did Hitler take over? And a lot of people don't realize that he did it very efficiently, very quickly, and completely legally. And by the time the Germans realized, there was nothing that anyone could do about it. And again, the majority of people were okay with what had happened. They wanted stability. They wanted the economy to recover. They wanted to feel proud of their country again. And again, they wanted somebody to blame. So they were willing to sacrifice certain rights in order to obtain those goals. I have to stop and just blow my nose. Are there any questions or comments about that piece before I kind of look directly at the Holocaust? So either I did a really good job or you're all asleep. Don, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Murray.
I'm wondering what other countries, European countries at that time, were observing, or if they were, and
a lot.
Other countries that eventually united with Hitler and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering what might have been going on.
He had a lot of fans. Obviously, Italy with Mussolini. Mussolini had already, you know, sort of started his fascist revolution in Italy. Places like Hungary were watching. Hungary became a firm ally of Germany. Bulgaria, a lot of the eastern, sort of central and eastern bloc countries did. Once Hitler takes over, once the Nazis move into Austria, the Austrian Nazis were waiting. You know, they were absolutely waiting for Hitler, you know, and the Germans to come in. So there were a lot of, I don't want to call them like strong men, but would-be dictators who were watching, just like Hitler watches the response of the rest of the world. Every time he would make a move, you know, against the Jews or, you know, against Czechoslovakia, he would stop and he would see, is anyone going to tell me to stop? And when nobody did, he would say, okay, they're okay with this. But there were a lot of others watching Hitler and saying, aha, here's how you do it. And he really, I mean, to this day, you know, we use, not we, you know, but many, you know, political parties use these techniques that were really developed by the Nazis of how you campaign, how you give a speech, how you hold a rally, you know, how you use propaganda. I mean, propaganda had existed before, before Hitler and the Nazis, but they absolutely moved it to a new level. And the world has been using it like that ever since. This idea, if you just repeat the lie often enough, at some point people will believe it because, well, you've heard it for a year. It has to be true. And that comes from Hitler and Goebbels, those ideas.
Erica, as you talked about the countries that admired it, and what was the United States stand? Or
we did not want to get involved in Europe.
But we knew what was happening.
We were watching. We knew. I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen to the Jews. None of that had happened yet. But the United States was very isolationist. Remember, it's 1933. It's the heart of the Depression. So, the United States, like so many other countries, is also struggling with unemployment, with violence, with all of the problems the instability that happens with the Depression. And so we didn't want foreigners. We were not interested in, there weren't enough jobs for Americans. So while the United States, was paying attention to Europe, I mean, FDR knew it was happening, we were not seeing ourselves at that point as sort of a global superpower. We were like, that's over there. That really doesn't affect us. And again, I mean, I'm not going to go into like the history of World War II, but we didn't volunteer to join World War II. We went because of Pearl Harbor. That's why the United States ended up fighting in World War II. Had Pearl Harbor not happened, we might eventually have felt compelled to go in, but we were not interested, or the majority of Americans were not interested until 1941 when Japan attacked. So, okay, so we'll take a little breath. And then we'll talk, and I'm not going to go for another hour, but I'd like to do sort of an introduction to the Holocaust and really start thinking about what actually is the Holocaust. We hear the word a lot, but what was it really? And so most people define the Holocaust as the systematic destruction of European Jews carried out by the Nazi government. Now, the perpetrators of the Holocaust were primarily German, but they had a great deal of help and support from collaborators in other countries. Close to 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were deliberately exterminated by the Germans during the Holocaust. And this number constituted 2/3 of the European Jewish population and 1/3 of the entire world Jewish population. 1.5 million of those Jews killed were children under the age of 18. And I can say that close to 200 of those killed were members of my family. Oh, I've gone in the wrong direction with my pages. Now, there have been other mass murders carried out in history. The slaughter of the Armenians by the Turks in the early 20th century, the millions killed by Stalin in Soviet Russia are just two examples of many. What makes the murder of 6 million Jews unique in history? Because this is unique, it is unprecedented, and it is fundamentally different from any massacre that has occurred up until this point. Now, the Holocaust is unique because every single one of the millions of Jews living in Europe was targeted to be murdered. And the eradication of the Jews was to be total. In principle, no Jew was to escape. So in this respect, the Nazis' assault on the Jews differed not only from massacres of the past, but also from Nazi campaigns against other peoples and groups, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Poles, and others that the Germans also persecuted. Nazi assaults on these people could be and were indeed murderous and devastating, and their victims numbered in the millions, and they too died in extermination camps. But Nazi ideology did not require their total disappearance from the world. So in this respect, the fate of the Jews was unique, because the racial ideology of Hitler and the Nazi regime proclaimed that being born a Jew meant that one was not a human being, and so, by definition, one was unworthy of life itself. According to the Nazis' biological racism, each and every Jew was a threat, including the old, the ill, women, children, even tiny infants. And so no Jewish community could be left alive. Under the Nazi regime, the SS, the mobile killing units that were known as the Einsatzgruppen, the German army known as the Wehrmacht, the order police, the guards in the death camps, and many others, all practiced a brutality that was unknown until this time. They worked Jews to death in slave labor camps. They shot them by the hundreds and thousands with machine guns and dumped the bodies into mass graves. They threw Jewish infants into the fires, and they built a vast system of concentration and extermination camps, the sole purpose of which was the production of corpses on a tremendous scale. Why? Why were Jews worked to death in unproductive tasks at a time when the Third Reich was experiencing an acute labor shortage? Why were skilled Jewish armaments workers murdered despite the pressing needs of the German army for more ammunition? Why were trains carrying Jews to the extermination camps given priority on the railroad tracks over trains carrying desperately needed German troops to the front lines? Why did the Nazis continue to insist that they were fighting an omnipotent Jewish power, even as the mass murder of the Jews revealed Jewish powerlessness and vulnerability? And so at the heart of these questions, again, lies a Nazi worldview that proclaimed that the Jews were the source of all the evils in the world. Nazi ideology held the Jews responsible for, among other things, this is just not a complete list, internationalism, pacifism, democracy, Marxism, communism, Christianity, the Enlightenment, and Freemasonry. They identified the Jews with the fragmentation of urban and industrialized civilization and the loosening of morality. According to the Nazis, the Jews were what they called the Weltfeind, meaning the world enemy. And in Hitler's racist ideology, the redemption of the German people and of Aryan humanity as a whole depended upon some type of a final solution to the Jewish question. Unless this demonic Weltfeind were removed, Hitler believed, there would never be true peace in Europe. And the Europe that Hitler envisioned and spoke about was one, again, that was to be united under German leadership, a Europe in which Germany fulfilled what the Nazis believed to be its natural destiny by expanding in the East to find living space for German people. The Second World War, then, which Hitler initiated, was, in his eyes and in the eyes of a Nazi party, a twofold war. First, it was a war for territory, for the German people to expand. And it was also an apocalyptic battle against a mythical Jewish enemy. So a question, or two questions to think about. Why was war necessary for the Holocaust to happen? And why did the Holocaust become more necessary after the outbreak of World War II? They're not exact, they sound like the same question, but they're actually not. So it's really war that makes the Holocaust a concrete possibility. The tremendous victories, those lightning-fast victories of the German Wehrmacht during the first year of the war brought millions of Jews under German control for the first time. And it's under the cover of war, particularly in eastern territories removed from Allied eyes, right, where the Allies can't watch. That's where the Germans found the space and the resources that they needed to carry out extermination. But the Holocaust, of course, something like the Holocaust, required more than just an apocalyptic ideology in order to be implemented. The Holocaust was also the product of one of the most modern and technically developed societies in Europe at the time. It was a society with a highly organized bureaucracy. And these streamlined, industrialized mass killings of the extermination camps were of a form previously unknown in European and world history. But at the same time that this modern, scientific, industrial society is developing these new assembly line styles of mass killings, they're also murdering millions of Jews by more primitive methods, hunting them down and killing them execution style over pits and forests and ravines and trenches. So there's another question that's hard to answer, but I think that's important to ask ourselves. Why was the Holocaust initiated by Germans? Why not by someone else? And as many of you know from some of my earlier presentations, anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, had always existed in Europe. And in fact, at the turn of the 20th century, right before Hitler comes to power, anti-Semitism is actually stronger and more influential outside of Germany, in places like Tsarist Russia, Romania, Poland, and Austria. And prior to 1933, when Hitler took power, Germany was still a state based on the rule of law, a state where, despite prejudice against Jews had still managed to achieve a remarkable amount of economic success. They were well integrated into society. They enjoyed equal rights protected by law, and they had a decisive influence on German culture. Okay, I'm going to skip that next little piece about anti-Semitism because I think most of you, or many of you, have heard it. The Germans couldn't have carried out the Holocaust unaided. Although they were its instigators and the driving force behind it, when it came to killing Jews, the Germans found many, many willing collaborators, particularly among Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Poles, and others. Austrians, whose country had been annexed to Germany in 1938, they made up a disproportionate number of SS killers, death camp commandants, and personnel involved in the Holocaust. So the Holocaust, in many ways, was sort of a pan-European event that couldn't have happened had not millions of Europeans by the late 1930s really wished to see an end to the age-old Jewish presence in their midst. And this consensus was particularly strong in Central and Eastern Europe, which just happened to be where the bulk of European Jewry lived. However, we should note that there was growing anti-Semitism in Western Europe and the United States during these years. And this anti-Semitism was exacerbated by the Great Depression, increased xenophobia, and fear of immigrants. Now, this growing Western and American hostility towards Jews was expressed in the unwillingness of British and American politicians and decision makers to undertake any significant rescue efforts on behalf of European Jews during the Holocaust. As early as the 1920s, the American immigration quota system had deliberately stopped the possibility of any mass immigration of Jews from Central or Eastern Europe. And the British, who since 1917 were in control of what was then called the Palestinian Mandate, and who had publicly committed themselves to the creation of the Jewish homeland there, they dramatically cut the number of Jews they allowed in, effectively denying the Jews another potential refuge. Hitler, as I said, he watched what other countries did. He noted the responses of the Western powers, and he drew his own correct conclusion that the West was not really concerned with any of his increasingly radical anti-Jewish measures. So the Jews of Europe, therefore, on the eve of the Holocaust, found themselves in a trap from which there was no escape. They were faced with the most menacing and dangerous enemy in their history, a power in the heart of Europe that openly sought their destruction. At the same time, other countries were also passing laws of their own to restrict Jewish rights within their borders, while pushing for the removal or emigration of their own Jewish populations. 3 million Jews were trapped in communist Russia and cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. And there was simply no place for unwanted and persecuted Jews to go. Now, the Jews of America at this time were very limited in what they could do for European Jewry. Contrary to Nazi and German claims, American Jews in those years had little, if any, political clout. American Jews were also restricted by their own insecurity, their fear of rising American anti-Semitism, and the reality of American isolationism that, again, before 1941, insisted that America remain unentangled in European affairs. So this Nazi myth of the Jews as a well-organized international power, right, that secretly controlling the world, could not have been further from the truth. World Jewry at the time was disorganized, powerless, had no agreed-upon political agenda. And before and during the Holocaust, the Jews did not have a state. They did not have an army or a common territory, let alone a coherent organizational center from which they could respond to this new threat. So during the Holocaust, the Jews would find themselves, for the most part, really disappointed by the lack of solidarity shown them by most of their non-Jewish neighbors once the persecution began. Even more disappointing, perhaps, was the ease and the quickness with which the legal protections offered them by European states and governments were withdrawn as country after country sacrificed Jewish rights without hesitation. So the Holocaust reminds us that xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism can lead to group violence on an unimaginable scale, and that any society, however culturally, scientifically, and technologically advanced, any society can become criminal once it loses its ability to distinguish between right and wrong. The Holocaust underlines the danger of trusting in power without ethical restraint, and it teaches us that each individual has to be responsible for his or her own conscience and fate, and that obeying orders is no excuse for criminal acts. A famous Holocaust scholar, Robert Wistrich, wrote, "If there is a general lesson then, it is that we must learn that evil can and must be resisted in its early stages, that we always have choices, and that there can be no place for racism and anti-Semitism in a civilized society. Thinking about the Holocaust is like staring into an abyss and hoping it will not stare back. It is the ultimate extreme case, a black hole of history that not only challenges our assumptions about modernity and progress, but questions our very sense of what it means to be human." So we have a choice, because it's 10 after 7 and I've been yammering at you for quite a while. I'm happy to stop if there are questions, if there are comments. Obviously, we have another session where I'm going to dive really deeply into a specific sort of piece of the Holocaust. There are a couple of things that I wrote down, the questions that I tend to get for the most part. So if you don't have some questions, I may, I can go through those. Or if you're feeling like, wow, this was enough, we can save everything till next week. So, but I'll start by, if anyone has any questions or comments, or there's something you want me to really make sure to talk about next week. Yes?
How is it that there's people that say it never happened? I mean, groups of people that...
There are. If you say it often enough, at some point somebody will believe you. And I was actually had gone back to, I almost showed a video, but in the end I didn't. But I was watching a video about after liberation when Eisenhower? Yeah. When they started liberating the camps. And he said, we have to document this. We have to, he brought the generals in. Patton couldn't go. Patton was like, I can't look at this. But he said, we have to document it. We have to film it. We have to interview, because at some point in time, people are not going to believe this happened. And he knew when they started to liberate the camps that people were not going to believe it. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much footage from the liberators, because Eisenhower was convinced that as time passed, it would be minimized, it wasn't so bad, and we certainly, there are many who deny the Holocaust. I would argue that that in itself is a form of anti-Semitism, to minimize Jewish experience, to say it wasn't as bad, you're exaggerating it, you're using it to get other things. But it's increasing. Holocaust denial is definitely increasing. So.
Well, I'm just, from just a personal experience, the first time I really learned about the Holocaust was here at UMFK when I took an honors seminar on the Holocaust. And I was just totally blown away. And I remember calling my mom and just saying, why did you never talk about, why didn't people like you do something about, to try, and so from what she said, that they did, as a, that, my mom just would have turned 100, but anyway, that they weren't given, they were just, raising kids, doing things, and it didn't really come, like, well, they didn't have 24/7 news or anything like that, but
Right. It was in the newspapers, It was not front page news. If you look at the New York Times, if you look at, some of the big papers, the news was there, the information was getting out. Obviously it didn't come out right away, but it was out, and people were coming, people did come from Poland and try. I mean, if you watch the new movie about Jan Karski, it was on The American Experience on PBS, about Karski desperately trying to get FDR to understand what was happening. And it wasn't news. They really didn't want to know, didn't quite believe it, didn't want it to disrupt the war effort. And that's me being generous. I think, the real reason is, well, it wasn't happening to us, it was happening to Jews, and that's, oh well, it doesn't really matter. And so ordinary people, who might not have gone to page 17 in the New York Times, wouldn't have known in this country. They knew in Europe. They knew in Germany. They knew in Poland. I mean, they knew. In the United States, and the State Department made a very determined effort to bury the news. That's absolutely, 100% proven. The State Department was incredibly anti-Semitic. They did not want Jewish refugees. They did not want to be forced to have to change immigration quotas. And they did not want people knowing. So the State Department buried cables from Europe and from neutral Switzerland telling the United States government what was happening. And they would intercept them and make sure that they did not, or they would delay as long as possible so that the news didn't get out. So your mother she wouldn't have known, she wouldn't have known. So, did I see any more?
I'm just wondering, there must be very few survivors of the camps now, still alive, still available to talk.
Yeah.
To
The
people.
fewer and fewer.
Are there groups that travel to educate school children and so on? I know
There's one left in Maine, a man named Charles, who still occasionally will come and either speak for us or go to a school. There are very few who are able.
There was a Holocaust survivor who came up to UMFK and spoke to the group.
I think it was Max. Max came. Charles has come, but we've lost a number just this past year.
Charles came up several times.
Did Charles come up? Yeah. He's not traveling long distances at this point, but he's still. And there was a woman from a survivor in New Hampshire, who came last year to a whole bunch of Maine schools, but primarily down in the southern part of the state. She's still talking, but now much of it is you have to watch the interviews. And again, while it helps, it doesn't grab students or reach students the way having the actual person there to say, this happened to me, this happened to my family. So we're really having to change how we educate and how we talk about this, because it's secondhand now. We've lost majority of the survivors, or those who survived were young children who often don't remember much, or they were hidden, and they don't know what it was like before. I call him my cousin. I think he's actually my father's cousin, but in my family, everyone is a cousin. And he's now 93. He was 7 in Vienna when the Germans came in and took over in Kristallnacht and took their apartment, and they had to live, in a stable. And eventually, he was sent alone to our family in New York. But he was 7, and he's now in his 90s, and so. The testimony that you would get from a 7-year-old is different from when we had, there were survivors who'd been in their teens or their 20s when things happened and could really express it much better and remembered more. So, Yeah, so it's how we educate is really having to change, unfortunately. So, Nancy.
When I was in elementary school, I went to a school that was taught by nuns that were they were stationed in Paris. They were French nuns, and some of them during the war were sent to concentration camps, and then they were forced to teach other children in the concentration camps. But they were tortured by a lot of the Nazi soldiers. They would have cigarette burns all over their necks, on their arms, and I just remember in elementary school when they were telling us what they had experienced. We were, very bored, so we were exposed to it. And they would show us some of the scars that they had from, being tortured while they were in the camps teaching. They were very lucky. But they were lucky they were able to escape and finally to the state.
Yeah, and you don't forget the interactions with someone who was actually there, or if you go, you go to the camps, and then it's a little more real, when you stand in those spots and you touch the places. So thank you, and I'll be back on Zoom next week because I can't drive all the way back up.
I think we'll be able to continue our